Welcome to the first of a series of conversations we're going to have with industry leaders on how our industry can play a role in helping make our country a more hospitable and productive place to work and live. Now, these are trying times for all of us with the pandemic and unparalleled economic meltdown, and most recently with the senseless killings of innocent Black men and women that have yet again reopened the festering wound of systemic racism in our society. NMHC is committed to the principles and values of diversity and inclusion. We're also mindful that we can't cure societal ills on our own. We can, however, make a difference in many ways. And in that context, I'm delighted to have a conversation with our former chair of NMHC, but also the founder, chairman, and CEO of Avanath Capital Management, Daryl. Avanath is a California-based investment firm that owns and operates apartments across the country with a focus on affordable and workforce communities. Since its founding in 2008, Avanath has acquired $2 billion of properties in 13 states and has a portfolio of 10,000 units. Before delving into the industry's potential responses to the literally burning issues of the day, I'd like you, Daryl, to talk about why you founded Avanath 12 years ago. But before you start, I'm not sure everyone knows that you cut your teeth in real estate finance. And along that journey, co-founded Capri Capital Finance, which became the first minority-owned DUS lender in Fannie Mae's history, as well as serving as an executive managing director of Centerline Capital Group. So why and how does a finance guy decide to become an owner-operator?
Well, good morning, Doug. I'm delighted to be participating in this. And I would say that what has motivated me throughout my career is growing up on the west side of Detroit and watching that community decline as I grew up. And what I have learned over the years that what many communities need are investment, and investment can make a big difference. And I started my career really as an equity investor and financer of apartments. And I thought that in founding Avanath that we would really take on, from an operational standpoint, affordable and workforce housing in communities of color that have been neglected because of a lack of investment. And so, I felt the need to create a company that we would roll up our sleeves and try to solve some of the challenges more directly.
Well, you have a template, though. You have a business plan that's a little bit unique. Maybe not 100% unique. The Rose companies are pretty progressive too. But what was it that made you bring this all together the way you have, and the business plan that you have?
Well, many of these things are trial and error. The one thing that is very clear, that part of our issue is we do not only invest in brick and mortar, we invest holistically, meaning that we invest in solutions that help our residents live a better life. For instance, with entitlement reform in 1994, Section 8 has generally 95% of the people who get a Section 8 voucher work. So what happens is the school bus pulls up every day at an apartment community with kids at 3 o'clock, and then the parents don't get off of work till 6 or 7. So solving for that 3 or 4 hours led us to do after-school programs in a lot of our communities, where we would provide a safe place and a snack for children that come home from school that are essentially latchkey kids with no parents at home. So what we have tried to do as a company is find solutions to solve some of the issues. I mean, there's a lack of retail in a lot of locations that we invest in and where we own properties. And one of the solutions there, we've made a deal where we've with Amazon, where we have Amazon lockers at a lot of our properties, so our residents can offer, they can get all kinds of goods and services. And so, again, we are trying to find solutions to a myriad of problems that exist in our many of our communities.
So before we delve into what you put together as a very thoughtful action plan for our industry to think about, let's step back just a little bit and talk about the crucible we find ourselves in, where African Americans comprise a disproportionate percentage of both pandemic-related deaths and as victims of police brutality. So I have a two-part question for you, Daryl. What are the root causes as you see them, and what can we as an apartment industry do about it?
You know, the root causes, number one, are quite complex, but I would say in general, it's a lack of investment, but it's also a lack of quality health care, education, which is, the schools in many of these communities. And these things are going to be highlighted by the fact that, as we are looking at many schools having more online education, that a lot of the inner city schools specifically do not have the capacity, nor do the students have the equipment to effectively do online education. So there are many causes, both of lack of access to quality food. I mean, many communities of color, but it's also some rural communities do not have quality access to healthy foods. You go through a lot of, I go through my own neighborhood in Detroit, and it takes you have to drive for, quite a distance to get to a grocery store, but you pass 20 fast food locations. And so these are the challenges underlying, and I think when you look at our business, our communities are quite diverse, and getting a few of the numbers, about 40% of our communities are comprised of African Americans and Hispanics. And so what happens at our communities has a very, very large impact on the well-being of that, of people of color.
So today, many institutional and entrepreneurial owners do embrace the fair housing laws, and they do not engage in discriminatory practices. But you argue that while that's a good and positive thing, it is not enough. And so why should the industry care about disparate health and criminal justice outcomes of people of color?
Well, I think that, the underlying, as I just mentioned, that 40%, about 19% of our communities are African American, and about 21% are Hispanic. And this is the overall apartment industry. I'm certain our communities are probably more like at least 50 to 60% African American and Latino. So why do we care? Because it's important, number one, if our residents are healthier, that means that they'll stay longer, and we won't have as high mortality rates amongst that group, so they can rent apartments longer and they can be healthy. The other thing is that we want upward mobility. I mean, the ability for people to grow economically helps us. I mean, our ability to raise rents to offset operating expenses is contingent upon people being able to grow their incomes. We also, if you look at some of the challenges that have arisen because of some of the injustice in communities, I think that is fuel some of the rent control initiatives that are out there, and simply people, we are very much aligned with people of color and both economic and social equity. And so that's very, very important because, again, without communities of color, we would not have viable businesses today. So it is a very important economic factor to us because that is 40% of our customer base. So we have to care about that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's now turn to your 8-point action plan, which I think is a great example for our membership to look at and think about. And what actions can we as an industry do to mitigate some of the poor health outcomes and adverse interactions with the law enforcement that occur with African Americans and Hispanics. And let's get right into each of your suggestions. And the first one that you mentioned to me is focus more investment capital on communities of color that have been traditionally underserved by institutional capital. And I know we both think that's a game changer. What has to happen there, Daryl, for that to happen? What are the pieces that have to come together?
Well, the pieces are, and the pieces are getting institutional investors to recognize that there are great opportunities to invest in some of the communities that they've traditionally ignored. When you look at the real estate sector, and if you look at kind of the B plus to A core market, it's about 8 million units. And that's where most institutional capital flows into there. And that's where all the apartment REITs, that's all where many of the institutional funds and the like are focused on. There's about 12 million units that are either in the affordable sector where they are rent regulated and also naturally occurring affordable deals. Now, it's interesting, in that sector, it's highly fragmented amongst owners. And so one of the things that we have been able to attract investors is to show that there's just less competition in that space, and there's a really significant need because, even though we buy a lot of our properties are rent restricted, we can bring economies of scale to that to really lower the operating expenses. I mean, for instance, we just closed on a couple of acquisitions which were built under the low-income housing tax credit in Denver. And I believe the previous owner, who was a smaller operator, was paying, probably double per unit for insurance than what we can bring to bear. So the fact is that it's a great investment, but there are many perceptions, and unfortunately, many have to do with race as to why people don't invest in those sectors. And so, we have worked very diligently to educate institutional investors with some of the metrics. I mean, for instance, our historic default rate on our portfolio in terms of rental delinquencies runs about 35 basis points. If you look at the industry, we typically underwrite somewhere between 60 and 100 basis points. What is fascinating, our Section 8 portfolio is actually lower than the 35 basis points. It's somewhere in about 25 basis points. So these are metrics that are compelling in the sense that the collection loss in our portfolio is a lot lower than people in the A space. So we try to make our case with institutional investors is in the sense that it is a more it's a better risk-adjusted return, and mainly because there is so much demand for that product. I mean, our average rent across our portfolio is $1,300 a month. If you look at the median income of a renter in America, it's about $40,000 a month, and those numbers work. So what we tell our investors that we're in a space that there is considerable demand and not nearly enough supply. So, we make the business case, but we believe that there are other operators and large institutional owners that should look at this. And if we had more people investing in some of these communities, I think we would see a change in a variety of outcomes, including health outcomes and issues with the criminal justice system.
Well, and also I'd add that you have 100% of occupancy and waiting lists for many of your communities, I know. And I know that you've also demonstrated to institutional investors that you're very competitive in the returns that you can give to your investors. So, but you teed up Section 8, so let's go to that one. That's number 2 on your action plan. And we at NMHC are very supportive of increased investment in Section 8 vouchers. The only rub that we have is that we think the program needs to be reformed to be less bureaucratic and more user-friendly. But talk about your experience with Section 8 vouchers. I mean, some members think it's just a bureaucratic nightmare. It's costly. They have to add staff. All the complaints that you get about Section 8. You've had good experience with it. So talk a bit about your experience.
Well, the first thing is that we have really built our business around the Section 8 program. And so on what, we have about 12 people that just work in the institute in compliance regarding our Section 8 and certainly other affordable programs. What is interesting about Section 8, and HUD is a highly maligned agency, and as you might recall, a few of us met with the secretary about a year or so ago, and we talked about that. And the one thing that we forget about Section 8 is that while we can point fingers at HUD, ultimately Section 8, they execute through a variety of housing authorities across the country. And I believe the secretary mentioned that there are like 2,400 different housing authorities. We deal with probably 50. And I can tell you from A to Z in terms of the best that we deal with, and then those that are very, very bureaucratic, it's a big discrepancy. I would say that many of them, and particularly in the larger urban areas, Los Angeles, they're fantastic. King County, they're fantastic. Chicago Housing Authority, fantastic. I mean, we deal with some of the large, Prince George's County. And so part of it is we build a relationship with many of those agencies. And the reason why it's important for all owners to look at it, I mean, unfortunately, too many Section 8 vouchers that residents don't believe that they can move out of communities that maybe have less opportunity. But what, the goal of when vouchers were created was to make something portable so that a resident can move to areas where there were maybe better jobs and better schools. And unfortunately, we have a lot of owners who really discourage accepting of those vouchers. And I think that, if people felt very comfortable moving in to different locations, I think we'd have different outcomes, particularly on the educational side. So, I know that they are bureaucratic, but I would think that some of the large companies in our business can make the investment in maybe a few compliance people to expand their participation in Section 8. I think that we certainly do not have enough vouchers, given as you know, that there's a waiting list of 7 years, and for people who have vouchers today, there are 8 to 9 residents who qualify who cannot get them. So, I think it's a very important thing for the industry to embrace that program, albeit it is a very program that, if you operate in multiple communities and dealing with multiple housing authorities, it is not easy. But what I would suggest is that some of the larger owners may, if you operate in a place like Los Angeles, maybe start there with one of the larger housing authorities and build a relation with them and reach out to gain some of their voucher residents. I mean, the one great thing about it is that our voucher residents, the turnover is very, very low. If they are in a quality apartment, our overall turnover is about 20% a year or less. And I can tell you our Section 8 residents, the turnover is a lot less.
And your delinquency and default experience is obviously proving itself as well. The third sort of pillar of your plan is to create community forums at properties with law enforcement and elected officials. Talk a bit about that. I mean, I think that's very innovative. I think people would be skittish about doing it, but I think you have proved that it can work.
Well, we bring our residents together for many reasons. One of the reasons I got into this business is that many people, particularly people of color, don't get a lot of voice in terms of things at their homes. I'll go to some of our communities and I'll see a young kid, maybe a young African-American child, who will look at me and he said that he owns our apartments. And I always turn to them and say, no, this is your home. I just take care of it for you. And I always let people know that. So if you really believe that, I mean, for instance, when we very often when we do painting, particularly exterior paint, we bring our residents together and we ask, which ones do you like better? I mean, why should I make the choice? It's their home. They should make the choice. So we believe in bringing our residents together to, opine on things in that community. But what we've also learned is, we will reach out and invite the police department or the fire chief or a city councilman to a forum that we will create, where our residents will talk about policing. They will talk about services in their neighborhoods. And we have found these to be very effective, but more importantly, it creates engagement. We own about 800 apartments in a community that candidly was quite challenged when we bought our first property, which was 528 units, and it's a project-based Section 8 property in North Long Beach, California. And then ultimately we bought the property next to it. And so one of the things, USC did a study that showed that when we started our community forums, that they looked at the voter participation, and those two properties make up 95% of a voting district. And we went from about 9% of the people voting to 51% of the people voting. And that's powerful as we look at various initiatives that are out there. And so we believe it's very important to have those forums to give our residents a voice. Unfortunately, in our business, homeowners get that very often are listened to by our elected officials more than renters.
Well, good for you on working on that. The fourth suggestion you have is near and dear to my heart, which is accelerate diversity at all levels and all functions of your organizations. So talk about how you've approached that yourself.
Well, I think that, we have certainly focused on it as a company. And, Doug, I give you a lot of credit. And I give a lot of credit to many of the leaders in the apartment industry. And I look at some of the chairs that I served under: Tom Bizzuto, Rick Campo, Peter Donovan, Marianne King, the list goes on, David Swartz, and Ken Ballack. These are people, number one, who are my friends, but number two, they believe in diversity. And so in a way, having this webcast and talking to you, I mean, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but I do think that we, as well as we're trying and as strong as the commitment is amongst the leadership, and I think, again, you go through who's who in the apartment industry, and relative to this issue of diversity, they've embraced it. But we just got to work harder at it, and we've got to get the numbers where, particularly at leaderships in companies, as well as public company boards, that they reflect the diversity of our communities. And again, Doug, I applaud you and the NMHC officers, and we have a diversity forum, and that where people like Marianne King and Julie Smith have just taken that a great, just really, have taken that to a great place. But we need to do more.
I think another thing that we need to really be mindful of is that when we're out using recruiters and so on, we have to be assertive with them. You need to give us a balanced slate of candidates, or don't work for us, period. The fifth thing that you want to talk about, which I know is really important to you and has had great positive consequences, is implementing wellness programs at your communities. Could you talk a bit about that, what you're doing there?
We created a program called Avanath Activate, where we started it at a number of our seniors communities, where again, somewhat in our self-interest, we want our seniors to stay living in independent living for a longer period of time. So we want them to be healthier, and so that's the objective. And I think it makes good business reason. But in apartment communities across the country, people are getting older. So we have started, and I actually got this idea from Jonathan Rhodes. Jonathan does this, where we put an examination room in a number of our communities. And for instance, we work with the University of Maryland Medical Center, where they send doctors and nurse practitioners to do wellness checks on our residents. Healthcare is a challenge in many communities of color where, candidly, it's there are just not enough facilities and not enough doctors per capita. And so this was a strategy for us to bring this to our residents, and we're going to try to continue to expand that program across the country. But wellness is a very important aspect of that I think all of us as apartment owners should be committed relative to our communities.
And you mentioned to me, Daryl, earlier that you have, how many seniors communities are you managing?
We have 20.
Okay, and you have a population of hundreds and hundreds of seniors in those communities, and you've had how many cases?
To our knowledge, we've had 2 coronavirus cases, and I think there is a correlation with that. Maybe we're lucky as well, but we believe that having a mentality of wellness within our communities, has a very, very positive outcomes. And I think and I know many of our A properties, we have very high-end athletic facilities that I guess we're not using right now because during this pandemic, we are very careful about common areas. One thing we recently did, and we implemented this about a week ago, because none of our residents can use gyms. We have given all of our residents a virtual, we made a deal with a company that does virtual gyms. So we have given each of our residents a subscription to that, which we just rolled out in the last week. So we're very excited about that initiative. And also all of our 350 staff members have access to it as well, and which, I'm going to be also using that. So.
Great. Your 6th suggestion is adopt a low-performing public school in your market area. And I can tell you from my own experience at Fannie Mae, we adopted a school in one of the toughest wards of the city. We stuck with it and provided scholarships for the kids to go on to college. It was made a huge difference in their lives. And so talk about your ideas there and what you've done.
Well, we have done, we have had a number of our employees volunteer at different schools to read. I've done that. I find it incredibly enjoyable to go and spend a day and provide the exposure to what we do also as an industry. And so I think that we need to push, throughout every community to have better schools, but particularly in communities of color. And with this coronavirus issue, we are seeing a gap. I can tell you my 2 children go to a very well-to-do Catholic school in South Orange County, and they immediately went from in-person school to online school in 2 or 3 days. Every kid has the same computer. They all have Wi-Fi at home. They all, and these are, and many of the schools do not have the technology platforms, nor do people at home. So we've got to bridge that divide, because I can tell you in my case, education was the difference maker that really got me out of the west side of Detroit. And I was very blessed that during the days that I was in elementary and junior high school, that Detroit was quite prosperous, and they built a lot of new schools that were the state of the art, so that I could later go to a University of Michigan and go to graduate school at MIT. And education was really my ticket to upward mobility. And I think it is that ticket in many of communities of color that we need. And we have to even the playing field as it relates to that.
Fantastic. The 7th pillar of your plan is to use one's status as a significant property owner to lobby for improved police and community relationships. And talk a bit about your idea for that and how to do it.
Well, we all have access. I mean, you could go, you pick a large owner operator. They have access to mayors, city council members, Congress, members of Congress, and we certainly use that as it relates to issues around, for instance, some of the slow growth advocates that we lobby to get more apartments built, and we're very effective at doing it. But we have to use that same power to lobby on some of these issues as it relates to healthcare outcomes in African American and Latino communities and the policing. I mean, it is equally as important of an issue. And, again, our members and I know amongst our leadership and that we have great access to people of authority. I mean, many have very close access to our president and vice president, and certainly, Doug, you've been very instrumental to facilitating that. As we've had meetings with the Secretary of HUD and the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve Chair. I mean, maybe we should organize a group of apartment owners that meets with the Attorney General to talk about this. So we have to take our access that all of us have and use it in a positive way to get better outcomes on some of these issues that are plaguing our cities.
I couldn't be more in agreement with that. The last of the 8 that you had mentioned to me as suggestions were to enrich locations that are sort of food deserts, as you call them, with farmers markets and other strategies to bring fresh food to residents. And I will say that here in DC, up until very, very recently, Anacostia, a very historic area in this city, was without a major chain. And that has changed, but it was only recently. So talk a bit about your philosophy on that.
Well, that becomes a increasing challenge in communities of color. I mean, it's certainly the retail industry in and of itself is under considerable change and challenge. And so it's only been exacerbated in many communities of color. I always lament when I go to my own neighborhood that I will pass 5 gun stores, because I used to count them. I would pass 5 gun stores and probably 20 liquor stores before I got to a grocery store. And that's, and that's several miles. So we have to figure out ways, and we've organized farmers markets at some of our communities where we've reached out. Again, we've looked at and are implementing some ability to get groceries online with our Amazon lockers. So we continue to try to address this because, and one of the problems that in many communities of color, not only is the quality of what's there within very, very small grocery stores, or really there's the equivalent of 7-Elevens, are the quality of food and also the price. So, as an industry, we have to figure out, and, it would be great to say, let's get shopping centers built in inner city neighborhoods, but shopping centers are closing across the country. So we've got to be thoughtful of coming up with solutions that can make people in urban areas, and particularly in communities of color, have better access to quality food.
Well, thanks. And Daryl, those are phenomenal suggestions for us all to think about. And it's not, capital intensive stuff you're talking about. You're talking about sweat equity, basically. You're talking about people hours and investing in relationships and so on. I think that, I applaud you for that vision. Before we sign off today, I'd like to ask you if you have any closing comments to the membership, because this is going to go out to the entire membership. And let me turn the floor over to you, and then I'll close it out.
Well, I would just say, I know there's a lot of anger that exists. And I've called a number of my friends who are CEOs of real estate companies, and they're angry. And it's this supersedes. And I think everybody in America is angry about immigrants. And my dad, Nolan Carter, used to tell me, he said, son, it's okay to be angry about injustice. But then my softer side of my history, which was my mother, Flossie Carter, would always say, Daryl, if you're angry, channel that into some positive action and do something about it. So I reach out to all my wonderful friends who are incredible people in this industry. I think that, you know, Doug, what you have created at NMHC in terms of an organization, but also bringing everybody to the table to address these issues. I just asked all my good friends to we can do more. And I ask you all to do more because it's important.
Thank you. And I have some thoughts too. And I know we're a nation of immigrants. Every single one of us, every single person is a blend of ethnicities. And that pluralism, has made us great in so many ways, but we are falling short in making sure that all elements of our society have a fair shot at a better life. And that means adequate housing and healthcare. It also means access to employment and opportunities for careers. And as you mentioned earlier, communities of color traditionally receive less investment in all of those categories. And we can do our part to reverse that regrettable course. And I call on all our members to get to us, to talk among yourselves, but also provide us opportunities to talk to you about what you're doing. Let's strategize. Let's figure out what we can do together. And so we can do more. I've heard from all of my friends and colleagues in this industry, we're ashamed, we're upset, we're angry, but we know we have to do more. So let me thank you, Daryl, for taking time to be with me today. And we both hope, I know you join me in this, that we hope you've been inspired to join us in creating better outcomes for the less fortunate in our society. So thank you again for being here and being with us, and best to everyone.
Thank you.